This is Interpreting Wine host Lawrence Francis welcoming you to a new type of series on the channel. While I love interviewing established experts in their field, I also recognize there is so much that is learned on the journey towards reaching that point. So in this series, I'll be speaking with wine professionals who are earlier in their journey to share their experiences in what I hope will be relatable and helpful for many of you listening. Indeed, all guests in this series are Interpreting Wine listeners themselves, and the name Peer-to-Peer is all about you, the listener, sharing the podcast space and deepening the amazing community that has grown around Interpreting Wine. If you'd like to be considered for future series, please do visit interpretingwine.com/peer. That's P-E-E-R. We continue the series today in the company of Alex Taylor of the online tasting company, in what is a fantastic deep dive into an entrepreneurial journey that began in early 2020. We hear Alex's origin story before discussing the problem that the online tasting company solves, before taking a technical deep dive into sulphites, a key discovery that they made along the way, which adds to the knowledge base in this area, adaptations they made to their own process, and some key takeaways and practical tips, especially suitable for those of you studying for diploma or MW. Enjoy.
My connection to the wine world, I'm the founder, along with Jamie Smith, of a company called the Online Tasting Company, who set up pretty much to do exactly as it says on the tin. We're not very good with creative brands, but we are very good at being easily understood. And the whole point of this was really, we understood that behind the massive craze for online tastings over the lockdown period, there was a real technical challenge to solve, which is how on earth do you get a small portion of wine, a sort of a tasting portion of wine, into people's hands. And so we thought that was a pretty tricky challenge to face, but we had absolutely no idea how hard it was going to be. But when you're off down that sort of road, you've got to stick with it or give it up. And we kind of persevered with it, and now we pack up wine samples for all sorts of people who want to do tasting events or sampling, even just marketing activities, getting liquid into lips of their potential customers. So we do it for Naked Wines and the Wine Society and some of the trades of bodies like Wines of New Zealand. So whenever they want to issue their new vintages for people to taste, you can host an in-person event, which is great and super brilliant for creating engagement. But there's a lot of people who can't make it to these events, and it's great to be able to get those samples in. So that's what I do on a day-to-day basis.
And fellow entrepreneur, I love that you've gone straight to the problem that you're trying to solve. I mean, I think that's the thing that just keeps us sane, isn't it? We've got to always keep that North Star. What is it that we're actually up to in the world? What is it we're trying to do here? But I'd like to just encourage you to sort of look back a little bit from there. Why wine? Why is it that actually that problem for wine has now become this sort of all-encompassing thing for you? And let's say life mission.
I think that's a pretty good description of it. It really does feel like a life mission. I just I could go back through the practical reasons. I started training as a winemaker. I went through Plumpton doing viticulture and winemaking, actually after a complete misdirection into it. We nearly bought a house that had a 5-acre vineyard attached to it. Okay. So I started going off down the rabbit hole of learning all about it, thinking, I know a little bit. I've drunk wine, I've been to some vineyards in Napa Valley in France. I've got to be able to pick the rest up fairly quickly. And suddenly you're left with this massive imposter syndrome, realising how much it is that you don't know. And that's when the long trips down to Sussex to go and study and to go out pruning in the vineyards. But it's a liquid I've always had a massive passion for, and I think that it's a time where we're seeing just wine consumption is dropping, and there's some real challenges that the costs go up and the demand is dropping. So we've got to do something about that. But yeah, this all actually spun out of the fact that I tried to get my winemaking hobby out of my garage and the laundry in my house. And so started up a little wine bar and shop with one of my friends, Jamie, who's a sommelier and a wine educator as well. And so he was going to run the shop. I was going to come in once a year, make some wine. And we opened on February the 19th, I believe, of 2020. So 36 days before we had to close our doors again. So that was the real kind of kick up the posterior that we had to do something different. So we had that famous startup pivot at the very early stage. And we had got lots of wine tasting events in-house booked up, and we couldn't give people their money back, so we thought, let's go and start repacking into small samples. The journey began.
No, this is great because as well, we're only in 2024, so all of this is going to be super fresh in your mind, and again, I think this will just be, I think, really interesting for entrepreneurs, people that are, maybe going down a slightly different route in wine. I think as well, one of the things I'm trying to do in this series is just shine a light on some different areas, and I feel as though the sommelier, the service route, the kind of wine buyer route is, it's been very well covered, and is a kind of a well-worn path, and sort of a more usual path. Your and maybe my path, and maybe some other entrepreneurs out there. This is I think a different path. So, take us back to those early days then. So the pivot has happened. Yep. You've got it now in your mind. Small samples of wine. This is going to be the thing. It can go in the post. It can go out to people. We can do things on Zoom. Guessing that was the kind of order of things. Where did you come across your first challenges around that time?
So I think the first challenges that we started to try to deal with were very practical. It was around about the fact that Amazon have kind of set an expectation up for the world that postage and packaging come for free. Yeah. And when we had a £25 ticket that we'd sold for a wine tasting, if you then have to go and buy 6 bottles that are more than £1 each, and then you have to start making up cardboard boxes to protect them, and then you tell DHL this is fragile and it's got liquids in it, and they're charging you £10, suddenly you're looking at the best part of £20 of cost just for the postage and packaging, and that didn't seem in any way shape or form what a consumer would pay for, and they just don't see any value in that. They want to spend the money on, obviously, the wine. That makes a lot more sense, not on the experience. So that was where we started down the route of looking into flexible packaging and other packaging forms. What we quickly realised was that from the world of flexible packaging, no one had the slightest idea about wine or wine science. And from the wine side of it, there was a really, really poor understanding of the science of flexible packaging. So we were trying to sort of reinvent everything. And the glass bottling industry is standing on the shoulders of giants. They've been doing this for millennia. So they know it works. And it's I liken it to Steinway build pianos. And the people at Steinway have pretty much no idea why a Steinway is so good at being a piano. In contrast, your Yamahas, your Kawais, your Japanese manufacturers, your Australian manufacturers of pianos are having to learn from scratch. So it felt like we were trying to go back and understand what it was. And so the obvious challenge, which we thought in our head, was it's going to be about oxidation. The wine is going to get oxidized. We all know when we take the cork out of the bottle or the screw cap off, that wine has a certain limited shelf life, and it's going to be on a downward slope forever. Now, the wine arrives to us in 75 centilitre glass bottles the vast majority of the time. So we're going to start that ticking bomb just by the very act of opening the bottle in the first place. So we went into this reading all the textbooks, which all say this is the chemistry of wine oxidation, and we started off trying to solve the problem of stopping the oxygen getting into the wine. And the first one that we came up with was a tasting we were doing for a New Zealand winery, and we packed up the wine and we left it by the door ready to be posted, but we just needed the addresses to send it to. Now, this was the middle of summer of 2020, and it was sitting there in the warmth, and after about 3 months we still didn't have the addresses. Suddenly they sent through the addresses. We were a little bit nervous about this, but actually we opened a sample of the wines, and most of them were totally fine, and then a few of them were completely awful. And I was like, oh God, what's going on with this now? Because we spent an awful lot of time trying to put in the best oxygen barrier we could that was available off the shelf into flexible packaging, and we would have not expected to see it going off like that. And this started happening a few more times, and we couldn't really place what was common between the wines that were totally fine and the wines which were not totally fine, because if it's in the same container, the oxygen's going in at the same rate. So it was a real mystery, and we had to start coming up with alternative ideas as what might be going on inside this. And so that was a real challenge, but really we had to start going back to understanding what were the characteristics of wine in a bottle. What was it about glass and a natural cork or glass and a screw cap that protect the wine so well? What are the different mechanisms by which it can go off? And that's hard. And it turns out that every wine is different, so it's very, very hard to treat it in the same way that you would treat another substance you're packing. If you're packing milk, you know what the potential spoilage paths are for that. If you're packing up acid. You know what the problems are with that. So you know the problem you're trying to fix, whereas with the hundreds of thousands of different wines available, there are some commonalities, but there are so many differences in the wine chemistry that could provide a different way it would go off. So, but we were all still under the impression that it was all about the oxygen, and that, you know, we all know inert gas beats oxygen. We've seen this with great technology like Coravans and all of that. But the more and more things we tried, the further and further we seemed to be from having an answer, until we really got a breakthrough in January of last year. So January 23. So we'd been doing it for 3 years. We'd settled on the fact that we knew that if we put the wine in the fridge, which is we would say to our customers, store your wine samples in the fridge. Now, stored in the fridge, these wines would be perfect for 6 months. Absolutely. Virtually every single wine that we looked at was totally fine when kept refrigerated for 6 months. And a lot of them were totally fine even at room temperature. But we were never quite sure which was which. And so it was like, right, we need to get a proper understanding of this. So we started really digging into it, which is what I came to sort of talk to you about, because it's such an interesting side of it that I don't think anyone really has covered in. Certainly when we were talking, I spent a lot of time talking to winemakers, to my lecturers from Plumpton. Really interesting. So in January 2023, we decided we would try something a little bit new that we believe that's been done on wine in bulk containers once or twice, but nobody seems to be using this kind of approach for the wine. But what we needed to do was to understand, first of all, what is the chemical processes by which this wine is going off, and also what happens with regards to sulphites in the wine, because we know that sulphites obviously react with the oxygen. It's an antioxidant to try to absorb any oxygen that gets into the wine. And sulphites exist in 3 different forms in the wine, which is kind of driven in an equilibrium by the acidity, the pH of the wine. And the more acid the wine gets, it exists in a sort of a molecular form of sulfur dioxide, just a gas. That is a particularly good microbial protector. It will protect against any rogue yeast or bacteria that get into the wine. It's better at protecting against bacteria than yeast, but it does offer some protection. Then as you start getting more alkaline, so less acidic, it goes into this form of, let me get this right, the hydrogen bisulfites, which is the SO3 2- ions, which you get. Now, this form is a very good antioxidant, so that can then absorb the oxygen and mop it up. So, but as the amount of the microbial side drops down, that SO2 drops down, so does the level of the antioxidant side, and they shift, the equilibrium shifts again, so some of it comes out of solution to which way it needs to go. So it has those 2 different jobs, protecting against the bacteria and protecting against the oxygen. If you blast it with oxygen, it will stop protecting against bacteria. But equally, if you get a whole bunch of a bacterial contamination in there, it's suddenly not protecting against the oxygen that's coming in either, and so you'll get that classic oxygen damage.
That was as a result of your experiments, or that is what you've just said there is the kind of the perceived wisdom?
So yeah, that's the perceived wisdom, and that's absolutely correct. There's no argument with that. Oxygen does damage wine. There's absolutely no problem with it. But what's really weird is that there seemed to be something else going on, because all else was equal, there's the same amount of oxygen going into this wine. Now we know that some wines have a lot of, particularly let's say a red wine with lots of tannins and lots of colour, they are also antioxidants, so they will react with the oxygen before it starts affecting the flavour in a way that a white wine which doesn't have so much of those things, that goes straight to the flavours and starts attacking that. So you start losing your sort of light aromatic compounds, the nice sort of citrusy fruit. You'll maybe even start to see the acidity starting to drop. But it was there seemed to be something a lot more than just was it red or was it white. The wine that gave us the biggest clue as to what was potentially going on was actually a Zibibo from Sicily. And that had about, if I remember right, about 15 grams per litre of residual sugar in it, and yet was quite lower in alcohol. It was about a sort of a 10.5% alcohol. So it was a nice, fresh, fruity style of wine. And one of these went on a round trip to Spain and came back to us, and by the time it arrived, it was puffed up like a balloon. And we thought, right, so something has been generating gas. It's likely to be carbon dioxide. that's almost certainly going to be a biological reaction that's going on. There's something happening in that wine. So should we go looking for evidence of what's happening in the wine? The classic way that you would start dealing with this is to basically to take a sample of the wine, pop it onto a slide, stain it up with some dye that allows you to see anything that's wriggling around in the wine, and look at it. And sure enough, that Zabibo was teeming with stuff. It was re-fermenting. So that little bit of sugar was now trying to become alcohol, and in a very stressed kind of set of conditions. It didn't have all the things it needed. Ironically, it didn't have enough oxygen. So stressed yeast produced horrible flavours. And that was absolutely what was going on. We'd made a pet nat, basically. So that was a really big clue. But then we started looking at some of the other wines which were going off, and we sent them off to laboratories, and there was practically no sign of any microbial activity whatsoever. So we're like, okay. So it's not the oxygen, it's not bacteria. What on earth can it be? I can't go into too much detail of what the exact process is that we use, because we're in the process of patenting it. But if you've ever seen the film Total Recall, where Arnold Schwarzenegger goes outside the protective atmosphere of his dome onto the surface of Mars, and his eye bulbs, it's not pretty. So effectively, we are doing that to the microbes, any yeast or bacteria that have got into the sample of wine during the packing process, and that kills them. It pops their membranes open. It doesn't change the flavour of the wine in any way, shape, or form. It's not like you're pasteurising it. There are some other techniques you could use, like pulsed electric fields, or obviously filtration is a pretty good one. But what we realised is that absolutely it seemed like no matter how clean you were, and we built a clean room, and we're validating the clean room, we're checking, even in this clean room, you've still got around 100,000 particles in every square metre of air that's in the room. That's just a lot less than in real normal life. And that's easily enough to get something into the wine. But so what we thought was, well, let's go back in time to when food was spoiling, and we didn't know much about that. And this takes us back to Louis Pasteur. At the time, people blamed the food going off on all sorts of things. Was it the oxygen? Was it demons? Was it there were all sorts of crazy theories going on. And he devised an experiment where he put a sample of food into a little glass vial, and he heat treated some, pasteurised some, and he ended up with 4 samples: 2 open to the world, and 2 closed. And of he would take 1 open and 1 closed, and he heat treated those. Now he found that the one which was open to the world and untreated went off. The one that was open to the world and had been treated also went off, because there's more stuff landing on it from the atmosphere around us. And the one that was not treated and inside the glass vial went off. But the one that was inside the glass vial, so protected from the air around it, and had been heat treated, lasted infinitely longer. So like, we've got to do something a bit like this. So we picked a range of 20 different wines, covering an incredibly broad range, everything from natural wines with no added sulphites, which are obviously hugely risky things to pack up, through to wines which have got low alcohol Rieslings with a bit of sugar in them. They really want to re-ferment. You have to filter them right before bottling. Through to things that we thought would be perfectly stable as a control kind of wine, so like a Rioja, and older vintages, things that were 20 years old. We popped in rosés, we popped in things with lots of aromatic things like Sauvignon Blancs with their thiols, which are really easy to oxidise. And we just went a broad spectrum, and what we did is we packed them all up through our standard process, which takes the wine out of the bottles, goes through under inert gas, puts them into a little aluminium pouch that we've created ourselves, and seals them all within the clean room environment. And we then randomly picked half of those from each wine, and we treated half of them, and we didn't treat the other half of them. And then it's a waiting game. There's something you can do called accelerated life testing, which is where you raise the temperature up a little bit to encourage any kind of microorganisms that are lurking in the wine to do its job faster. It's useful, but it doesn't recreate the real world of, you get different things are operating at 30 degrees than would be operating at 15 degrees. Different organisms like the temperature or don't like the temperature. So it was really a waiting game. So we started checking these wines every month. And after the first month, a non-alcoholic wine, a de-alcoholized wine that we'd gone, the untreated one had already inflated like a balloon. So we knew that's re-fermented. That's definitely something biological. Okay, go and dig out the one which we've treated. That looks fine. So we opened it up, we sent both of them to the lab. Sure enough, got exactly the same results. It's perfectly drinkable compared to a fresh bottle. The treated one had survived, and it was the same for the no-low Sulphites wine. There was a roller, the Perrin family Nature from the Côte d'Rhône. The one that had not been treated was rancid. It was the most disgusting thing I'd ever smelled in my life. And then we came back after 3 months, and you started to see some of the wines which were perhaps a little bit more stable were still starting to go off and develop those kind of oxidised aromas that we would associate. They'd lost their fruit, they were starting to just feel a bit tired, and they weren't faulty, they weren't horrific, but they were just nowhere near as fresh as the treated samples. And come 6 months, it's like, okay, all of the treated ones are still absolutely perfect. And so that was a really interesting thing. So what was very strange again was that even the ones which were going off were showing such low levels of microbial activity when you looked in the lab, you did the inspection under the slide, that it was, we know for a fact that it's being caused by that, because the only difference is we'd killed everything in that one that was good and we hadn't killed it in the stuff that was bad. So it had to be caused by that, but it's such low levels of microbial activity that are causing the wine to spoil. And so yeah, this was a holy moly moment, because here is a wine which is in an identical container, has had an identical amount of oxygen through the packing process, an identical amount of oxygen through its aging process, and one is perfect and the other is #oxidised, and it's nothing to do with the oxidant. And it all comes down to that equilibrium with the sulfites, again, that as these few yeast or bacteria start to get into the wine, start trying to multiply, they are binding up a lot of the sulfites in the wine and lowering the level of antioxidant protection, which is then giving you a faster reaction to what little oxygen there is coming in. So it is oxidizing aromas, it is doing that, but it was caused by the bacteria, not by the oxygen itself.
No, this is really fascinating. But I think there's a part of it that I maybe have missed a little bit in this amazing story. But so you knew to treat that, and I guess that the treatment part is the part that you're patenting.
Yeah.
But kind of a step before that, and what you're describing here in terms of the essentially the resilience, I guess, of the wine being reduced in the face of even that tiny amount of oxygen, which presumably, well, I guess, did that account for those samples that you'd seen earlier, which they were from the same bottle and one had gone off, and I guess two-part question: was that actually the reason why that was happening? And secondly, how did you discover that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think we didn't find too much between two bottles of the same wine going off in different ways. It was always this batch of wine from this producer. It will either be perfect after 12 months or it won't be perfect after 12 months. So you've got to eliminate the potential causes one by one. Now, one of the big bits of work we did was looking through a lot of research which DM carried out into natural corks. And it turns out that there's 3 different parts of oxygen damage that affect a wine. There's 4 if you include when the actual closure fails at the end of its life. But there's what they call the packaging oxygen, which is how much oxygen was left in the pipes, or was it splashing into the bottle in an open environment? Did you properly manage to get all of the oxygen out of the bottle before you put the wine in? So that's the packaging oxygen. You then, with a natural cork or a DM, there is something called the initial release oxygen, which is oxygen that was trapped up in pores of this natural material, which over a period of about 6 to 9 months gets squeezed out into the wine. DM ones are very predictable with that. Natural corks are a lot more variable. Some of them will dump a whole load of oxygen into the wine in that first 6 months, which is what leads to a lot of the bottle variation. And then you've got the steady state oxygen transfer rate, which is what people generally talk about. And when we benchmarked a load of classic sort of technical corks like the DM Origines, or we found that they were all coming out around about 2 milligrams of oxygen per year for every litre of wine. Now, that's great, but 2 milligrams into a litre of wine, obviously, if you're only dealing with 100 millilitres of wine, you've got that same cork, it's going to have 10 times the effect of it. So effectively, compared to a 75 centilitres bottle, our 10 centilitre sample would age 7.5 times quicker, just with that same oxygen. So yeah, that was another little bit of a oh yes moment, yeah, where we realised that some of our assumptions, which had been based on just a theoretical container of wine and how much oxygen was going in, actually we need to be not just the same as a cork, we need to be 7.5 times better than a cork. And most flexible packaging is not designed for that at all. We're now on our 4th generation of material that we've come up with, and there's been an awful lot of adjusting thicknesses of the aluminium, adjusting thickness of the inner sort of barrier layer, which is the same as a can has, just so that we benchmarked it. We decided that this cork lets in 1.8 milligrams per litre per year. Let's recreate that. So that's what we aimed for, and that was at the heart of eliminating that whole sort of variable of, if it's not the oxygen, it's got to be something else. So yeah, absolutely, with those pouches that we're going off quickly. On our first generation of film, yeah, we were a little bit quicker on the oxygen rate than we needed to be. But having fixed that problem, stuff was still going off in a week, 2 weeks. If it was a super fragile wine, if you popped a non-alcoholic wine into that pouch, they'll have 20 plus grams a litre of sugar in them and no alcohol to preserve it. They really are super, super unstable. Which is why they have to have a best before date on them and not an alcoholic wine. So yeah, that was everything that we found can be traced back to that, because we took in that set of 20 wines, the first 20 wines, and then later now we've done more than 100 different wines through the process. We haven't seen a single one of them going off. So it does seem that the microbial damage that gets in just from the atmosphere, just when you open that cork for the very first time, that is at the absolute heart of what makes your wine go off. So if you do, this is a top tip for everyone at home. Sorry if you've been bored by the science so far, but this is the takeaway, I think, for what you should do with your wine at home. Keep the container open for as little time as possible, because for all the time that container is open, stuff is coming in from the air, and pop it in the fridge. So I think, obviously, if you've got a system like a Coravan, then that's brilliant as well, but popping it in the fridge would stop even the slightest chance, because we all know that we've seen some wines where we've Coravanned it and it's been perfect for several years, other wines where it might have been a few months. Pop it in the fridge, and the fact is that those few, it might even be 100 cells of yeast that have got in from the environment, they will be in a pretty much dormant state. And it's the same reason you keep your food in the fridge. Yes, you wrap it to try to keep a bit of oxygen off, but the main thing that happens when you wrap it and you put it in the fridge, you're stopping the bacteria and the yeast from falling onto the food and starting to make it go rancid. What was quite interesting was that we did have a few failures of our new film in the early days after this process, because where we've Arnold Schwarzeneggered the film, the entire finished sachet of wine, sometimes the oxygen layer would be a little bit damaged, and on those ones where it had peeled away, you'd got the pure version of oxygen damage. So oxygen damage without any of the microbial things. And that was absolutely your classic baked apple kind of aromas, the sort of the aldehyde-y smells that you start to get from, that everyone knows and associates with the oxygen damage. But they still hadn't gone rancid in the same way that the ones which had been affected by the bacteria had. So, yeah, that was quite an interesting little discovery. And we had to strengthen up the film again and put an extra layer. We actually, added in some barriers. Yeah.
Listen, I think, and I think a lot of people will love the geekiness. Again, the whole idea of the series is to shine a light on people who are pushing the envelope, who are, as you say, you're discovering as you're going along. You're an entrepreneur. You're changing stuff. You're improving your product as well, and kind of getting that out there. I think, though, in closing, though, what would really be interesting for me, and I think would be really interesting to kind of bring this all together, is maybe mention one or two things that you think, okay, actually, either like in the zeitgeist around looking after wine, preserving wine, or even to the point of what's being taught on things like professional qualifications, or things that people in the wine trade sort of assume. What might be one or two things that you think, we should be reconsidering those things, or maybe there's more to be discovered there, and you're going to be part of that.
I think that the term oxidation as it's used today in wine education and wine communication is more of an umbrella term. You think of it as an umbrella term. It's just wine damage. You mean the wine is damaged and the wine is old. Some of that will have been done by oxygen, but there are lots of other mechanisms. You could have malolactic fermentation might have kicked off because this is a wine that they deliberately tried to stop going through MLF or MLC, and an Enococcus bacteria has got into it and is now munching its way through that. That will be a different kind of spoilage. But again, you would just say there's something wrong with this wine. So I think just be aware. It doesn't matter if the wine's off, it's off. but in terms of understanding the process of what's going on, particularly for diploma and MW students, think through to the other aspects. Think through to the microbial side of it as well, because it's much more significant than we thought. In fact, I would say that in terms of the packing up that we do, the microbial is the most difficult and most important thing for us. Then it's probably the steady state oxygen transfer rate, so getting that matched up beautifully, and then finally only after that is it the question of how much oxygen did you introduce during the packaging. Like we've seen lots of people are out there going, this is the most important thing, we've only introduced a 1/1,000,000% of oxygen in through our entire packaging process. Cool, but it's now in a plastic bottle that leaks in at a rate of 100,000 a year. So it's like, congratulations, you've done that bit, but that wasn't the important bit. And then also, it's going to re-ferment. So oxidation as it's currently used is a massive umbrella term, but there's a lot of other things going on beneath that.
A huge thanks to today's guest, Alex Taylor of the Online Tasting Company. While you're here, why not reach out to Alex to let him know what you thought of the episode and to ask any questions that they raised? You can visit onlinetastingcompany.co. The link is below to learn more and to get their contact details. Next time on Interpreting Wine, we're taking a short break from the peer-to-peer content, switching the focus to Spain to continue the Sierra de Gredos special series. Next time in episode 558, you can discover more about this region by virtually attending their flagship wine event, Conectando Gredos. I was, of course, there this year, where I caught up with 4 local producers and 2 international guests. Can't wait to share this incredible event from a super interesting and progressive wine region, one which, interestingly for now, is still flying under the radar. I'll also be sharing details of how you can attend the fair next year, with the 2025 edition to be held in the Sierra de Gredos, around an hour from Madrid, on Sunday, the 1st of June next year. Make sure you're subscribed to be alerted when that episode goes live. See you then.